Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar on measuring social inclusion today. My name is Camila Gawanza. I'm a knowledge management consultant at the World Bank, and it is my pleasure to be your moderator. Today's webinar is actually part of a series on social inclusion, and the series was inaugurated last month with a webinar on the foundations of inclusion, where Maitreyi Das actually gave us a nice overview of the topic and basic concepts and also operational framework. While today we will take this topic one step further and talk about something that I think most of you are very interested in, measurement. And we are joined by Amjad Das, who will take the subject one step further, and he will talk to us about how do you measure social inclusion, how do you track progress, when do you know that social inclusion has been achieved. And he will discuss recent developments in this subject matter, and we'll talk about attitudes, perceptions and their importance, and multidimensional and subjective well-being. And he will talk about what these indicators can reveal about social inclusion. And Amjad is a social development specialist at the World Bank. He, at the World Bank's Social, Urban, Rural, and Resilience Global Practice, and he's trained as development economist with research areas in poverty, gender, and social inclusion. He also works with original operational teams on several areas of social development, as well as on the design, monitoring, and impact assessment of policy reforms and other interventions. Before this position, he taught that at the American University, and he also consulted for a number of agencies. And I should also mention that Amjad is one of key authors of the Inclusion Matters report, on which this series is based. And I don't know if you've seen this report. We will begin with his presentation, then we'll move to a polling exercise where we will ask you 3 questions. And finally, we will open to Q&A, so please feel free to send your questions at any time. Thank you so much. We look forward to a very interesting session today. Amjad, over to you.
Thank you, Camila, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning in Washington and wherever you are. So, as Camila mentioned, this is the second seminar in our social inclusion webinar series. And we wanted to focus, as part of the second webinar, on measurement. Measurement is important because we need to establish the extent and depth of inclusion and exclusion before we can come up with policies and programs to address social inclusion and exclusion. It's also important in terms of monitoring progress over time. And it's also important because what we measure is what we value. So if we decide to measure economic outcomes, then that's essentially what we're saying to the world, that these are the things that we value. But if we also start measuring things based on identity, based on race, based on gender, based on ethnicity, then we are sending a different message, that these identities are also valuable for us. So measuring social inclusion is critical for policy purposes. It's also important for research. But at the same time, successful measurement depends on identifying social inclusion and exclusion issues successfully, given a particular context. And at the same time, it depends on available data sources and the scope for empirical creativity in analyzing the data sources that are available. So we wanted to start by introducing the conceptual framework of the Social Inclusion Matters report. And we'll start with some definitions, because we believe that the framework and the definition that Inclusion Matters report puts together is actually a good starting point to think about social inclusion issues. And that gives us a good framework to move forward in terms of identifying the outcomes and the processes of social inclusion and exclusion, and coming up with indicators that we can monitor over time, or that we can use to sort of measure the depth and extent of inclusion and exclusion. So how did we define social inclusion in the Inclusion Matters report? Social inclusion is the process of improving the terms for individuals and groups to take part in society. So this is a broad definition that we use to sort of provide a general framework for the overall book. But we also have a sharper definition where we define what we mean by terms and what we mean by the individuals and groups. So this second sharper definition says social inclusion is the process of improving the ability, opportunity, and dignity of people who are disadvantaged on the basis of their identity to take part in society. So the second definition gives you a little bit more information about how we conceptualize social inclusion. How can we improve social inclusion by focusing on people's abilities, opportunities, and their dignity? And it also gives you a little bit more idea about who the excluded groups are. We are specifically focusing on people who are disadvantaged on the basis of one of their identities. Of course, social inclusion is a very context-specific concept. It's specific to time, to place, and to identities. So, for example, what can be considered an exclusion issue in Europe? Let's take the issue of migration. European countries have been receiving a lot of migration from developing countries, and within the Union from other countries. So in that context, exclusion might be based on migration status. But then you move on to another country, let's say to Brazil, where race has been gaining, race and ethnicity has been gaining more and more attention in the last decade. Then it's possible that exclusion happens on the basis of racial and ethnic factors. It's also specific to time. So again, talking about the Brazil example, racial issues were not necessarily on the agenda maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago in Brazil. But over time, as the racial democracy has advanced, these issues became out in the open for public debate and influenced research and policy. Social inclusion is also multidimensional. It can happen in multiple areas. It can happen in different magnitudes and in different directions. So it can affect economic outcomes. It can affect voice, participation, power. So these things have an important impact on how we measure social inclusion and exclusion. Because social inclusion is related to poverty and inequality, but it usually goes beyond these two things. And this ties back to the idea of focusing on multidimensional aspects of social inclusion. And finally, social inclusion is both an outcome and a process. So we can usually social inclusion or social exclusion is manifested in terms of poor outcomes, maybe in terms of poverty, maybe in terms of falling on the lower tails of the income distribution. But it usually goes beyond these outcomes. There's a process that precedes these outcomes that we see that are resulting in these outcomes. So whereas outcomes are manifestations of inclusion or exclusion, there are often deeper processes that precede these outcomes. So all of these factors have a bearing on how social inclusion and social exclusion are measured. So in this talk, we wanted to focus on our experience while we were writing this book. We conducted some analysis using different data sources and came up with several indicators, collected some new data, but mostly used available data sources. So I just want to share that experience in terms of how we analyze these variables, what kind of data sources we decided to use, and what we think those data sources can reveal about inclusion and exclusion. What I will not be doing during this presentation is to propose one single indicator for measuring social inclusion or exclusion. Just like I said, inclusion is context-specific, it's multidimensional, it's an outcome and a process. So it's very important to sort of start from this point and think in terms of the specific characteristics of social inclusion and how that affects measurement. I hope nobody was expecting to come up with a single indicator, because that we will not be doing this today in this presentation. So usually the first step in identifying inclusion and exclusion, both the issues, both the thematic issues, and also the groups that are included or excluded, is to ask a very basic question, which is, are there groups who are proportionally or disproportionately represented in poverty, in inequality, or in a wide range of outcomes that you can think of? So the first step is to disaggregate outcomes by identity. And in that regard, the Inclusion Matters report gives you a good starting point in terms of focusing on the different identities and specifying the ones that are most likely to affect inclusion-exclusion outcomes. So the Inclusion Matters report says that identities are socially constructed, and they affect people's achievements and their experiences of interacting in society. So inclusion or exclusion can happen on the basis of gender, it can happen on the basis of ethnicity, it can happen on the basis of disability status, sexual orientation. And some of these identities may confer advantage, while others confer disadvantage. And it's also possible that at the intersection of these different identities, there are specific vulnerabilities or specific advantages. So today I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C. as a World Bank staff member, but at the same time, I am male. At the same time, I am an immigrant in this country, and I'm the citizen of a developing country. So every individual wears different identity hats, and each of these may confer different advantages and disadvantages in terms of how they're excluded or included in the society in which they live. So just to take a very basic example, just to start off. In Uganda, electricity access is generally low. And that's more the case in rural areas than in urban areas. But then if you disaggregate who has access to electricity, in a country like Uganda where there are several ethnic groups, you see that one group may actually be disproportionately represented in having good access to electricity, whereas others might be on the opposite end of the scale. And the same finding also holds for water security or insecurity in Uganda. And you may be wondering that, access to electricity is also mediated by other factors, whether it's the location in which one lives, whether it's the regional development of the area where these groups live. But then those factors themselves might be endogenous in the sense that where you live, or where the regions that receive attention, the regions that receive electricity, the regions that are more developed, might be hosting one particular ethnicity or a couple of different ethnicities and not the others. So, of course, this graph in and of itself does not say anything about these factors that might be driving these differences across ethnic groups, but it's a good starting point in the sense that, if you disaggregate any outcome, even an outcome that's generally low at the country level, you can see remarkable differences and variety across ethnic groups. So, like I mentioned earlier, identities interact with each other, and there could be specific vulnerabilities or advantages at the intersection of identities. So it's possible to use different data sources to sort of map out and get a sense of the magnitude of disadvantage associated with having multiple identities. So in the previous graph, I was just plotting one variable across different ethnicities. In this graph, we are actually doing multivariate analysis using census data on school completion rates and controlling for people's age and location. We are looking at educational gaps across 4 different groups. So we took the Bolivian census. We divided the people into 4 groups: Spanish-speaking males, Spanish-speaking females, Quechua-speaking males, and Quechua-speaking females. And again, controlling for location and age, we estimated the probability that these people, each of these 4 groups, have completed secondary school. And as you go from a Spanish-speaking men to a Spanish-speaking woman, you see that the secondary school completion rates falls by 5 percentage points. But as you move from a Spanish-speaking Bolivian woman to a Quechua-speaking Bolivian man, you see that the likelihood of completing secondary school falls by 14%. And then if you finally focus on indigenous women who are Quechua-speaking in the context of Bolivia, you see that the secondary school completion rate falls by 28 percentage points. So while at the aggregate you see very small differences, as you disaggregate more and more on the basis of multiple identities at once and controlling for a range of other factors as well, you see that disadvantage actually can accumulate across different social groups. So what is it about being woman within the indigenous group that confers such a large gap in educational attainment? We don't necessarily have the answer for that, but the first step is to map these huge gaps in educational attainment by multiple identities at once. So the 2 examples that I've spoke about so far focus on access to services, access to education services, access to electricity services, access to water. But as we say in the Inclusion Matters report, inclusion and exclusion can actually happen in multiple areas. It can happen in markets, it can happen in services, and it can happen in spaces. And outcome disparities across different identity groups in each of these areas can be symptoms of inclusion or exclusion. So there was a question about financial inclusion, for example. So that would fall under markets. There has been a huge effort at the World Bank to measure financial inclusion and exclusion in untapped markets. And in recent years, we've considerably increased our knowledge of who is being excluded from formal credit, formal savings. These financial instruments usually also provide access to social services. There are mechanisms for providing social services. So it's important to map who is being excluded, on what basis, and from what type of services, and how it affects their well-being in a more broader sense. So measuring social inclusion or exclusion in markets, services, or spaces, and under each of these headings, focusing on a particular sector. So different sectors, say land sector under markets, housing, credit, labor markets, can give you a good idea about who is being included and excluded. But these are partial views in the sense that you're focusing on a gap in one area of life, whether it's access to labor market, whether it's access to electricity services, or whether it's access to political processes where you can express voice. But there are a bunch of indicators that are readily available for researchers to look at multiple areas at once. So these indicators range from the Human Development Index from the 1990s, which was created by UNDP, and that indicator measures life exclusion across 3 dimensions: per capita income, years of schooling, and life expectancy at birth. And then since the 90s, there has been a huge effort to measure well-being in terms of income plus other things. And starting with HDI, which only focuses on 3 indicators, and going all the way up to the Social Progress Index, which is relatively new and focuses on 54 indicators across 12 areas of life, you have options to sort of select what matters for your purposes, what inclusion, exclusion matters are relevant in your particular context or country of study and time of study. And these indicators also vary in terms of whether you can measure the dimensions, the specific dimensions that you want to focus on, or some of them are composite indices that actually put specific weights on different dimensions of well-being, and they give you a simple score to make cross-country comparisons. So far I've been focusing on measurement in terms of standard indicators based on readily available data sources. But social inclusion is also about subjective well-being, and it's also about feelings of inclusion and exclusion, because individuals and groups can be included or excluded, even if they're poor or even if they're not poor. So take the example of a rich homosexual man living in an African country, for example. So that person is not necessarily poor. So poverty would not be a good measure of their exclusion, but they might be excluded from society in such a drastic way that they're at risk of death. So it's important to focus on feelings of inclusion and exclusion, as well as the specific indicators and outcomes of inclusion and exclusion. So subjective well-being indicators can be very useful in identifying exclusion, because people act on the basis of how they feel. And feelings of being included or excluded can influence people's abilities and opportunities, as well as have a lot of behavioral outcomes, as the latest World Development Report here at the World Bank focuses on mind, society, and behavior. There are lots of behavioral experiments in the economics field, which has been preceded by years of research by sociologists and social psychologists, focusing on how social factors and behavioral factors affect outcomes. So attitudes and perceptions can reveal who gets included and on what terms. And again, just like with multidimensional well-being measures, there are a host of different data sources that one can use to measure attitudes and perceptions across countries and within countries over time. And these include the barometer surveys for different regions, the world values surveys, the more recent Gallup poll, and Pew attitude surveys, among others. So I just want to give a few examples of measuring attitudes and perceptions. And the first example actually comes from the World Values Survey. So what we did in this example is we took 2 attitude questions and plotted them against each other. Again, very simple bivariate level analysis, but it gives you an idea about a very interesting relationship. So on one hand, we have percentage of respondents who reported that they don't want to have people who are infected by HIV/AIDS to be their neighbors. And on the other hand, we have percentage of people who would not like to have homosexuals as their neighbors. And when you plot this data against each other, you see that there's close to a one-to-one relationship. Generally, in countries where people do not want to be neighbors with homosexuals, are also countries where people do not want to be neighbors with people infected with HIV/AIDS. And again, this doesn't necessarily tell us much in terms of how these groups are included, but it tells us that the exclusion of these groups can be related to each other. And it could be sort of underpinned by the same belief, whether it's a morality ground, whether it's a religious base. And this can sort of over time multiply the exclusion of these groups. And just moving on to comparing attitudes with outcomes, it's also possible that the attitudes and perceptions that we observe in the World Values Survey and other barometer surveys and attitudes and perception surveys are related to actual outcomes, actual standard indicators that we use to measure certain things. So in this particular case, we're plotting the female labor force participation rate across countries against the percentage of respondents in countries who think that men have more right to jobs in times of crisis when jobs are scarce. So again, you see a negative relationship here, showing that in countries where people think that men have more right to jobs are also the countries where you see female labor force participation rates being very low. So attitudes and perceptions can be related. Again, we don't know which one causes which. We don't know whether people think that men are entitled to jobs because of these beliefs, or because labor force participation is low, or whether labor force participation is low because of the belief that men are entitled to jobs. But at the very least, we know that these two concepts are related. And finally, I just want to make a point about looking at attitudes and perceptions and how we can compare them across contexts. This graph shows that attitude surveys don't have to be compared with outcomes or with other variables in the same surveys. Even on its own, just taking one variable out of these surveys and looking across countries can tell you a lot about feelings of inclusion and exclusion across very different contexts. So this graph shows percentage of respondents who reported that in their country, people are treated unequally under the law. And you see that in majority of countries, people are saying that it's either often or always the case that their governments are treating them in an unequal way, or their people are unequal under the law. And again, this is not being compared with any outcome or with any other perception indicator, but what it tells you on its own is that feelings of exclusion and unfairness, inequality, when they're this widespread, potentially points at issues, deeper issues of exclusion that are at stake. So exclusion can be a problem for many. It doesn't necessarily have to be about marginal, vulnerable, small groups. The majority of citizens can also feel included or excluded, and we have ways of teasing out these relationships using attitudes and perception surveys. So before I conclude, so far I've been talking about indicators, whether they're standard indicators like income, access to services, or whether it's perception or attitude indicators, subjective indicators. At the end of the day, these data are collected through surveys, and sometimes these survey data sources may not give us enough detail about how the process of inclusion and exclusion occurs. It just gives us an idea about the outcomes or the manifestations of inclusion or exclusion. But moving towards social inclusion is not just about addressing these outcome disparities across different identity groups. It's also about unleashing the grip of different identities of exclusion, which give rise to these outcomes. So it's about understanding the process of inclusion and exclusion. And this is where mixed methods and going beyond indicators and using qualitative and quantitative data sources and methods and instruments becomes really handy. So, like I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, social inclusion is both a process and an outcome. And sometimes we see gaps that we cannot really explain using our theories or using what we know about a particular discipline or a particular country. And in those cases, using these combined methods might be very useful. Just to conclude with an example. So we know that in India, there's a big problem of high maternal mortality rates among tribal women. And when we ask why this is the case, using secondary data sources, the National Family and Health Survey, we see that 80% of tribal women deliver their babies at home instead of using hospitals or health clinics. And this is, again, disproportionately large compared to women who do not belong to tribal groups. Right? And then we ask why. Why is this the case? Why is it the case that tribal women are not using health clinics and hospitals? And when you do a second survey, a follow-up survey to find out the reasons behind self-exclusion, if you will, from health services, there are a wide range of responses. Some people talked about the fact that there are no female providers in these health clinics, the fact that they don't trust the facilities, they considered it too costly or too far. But then the most commonly cited reason for not using health clinics was that people did not think that it was necessary for them to use health clinics. And this is a surprising finding because we all know the benefits of giving birth in a well-equipped health institution. So researchers went in and did some qualitative work to find out why is it the case that tribal women are self-excluding themselves, because conventional explanations for such a drastic outcome is that these people do not necessarily understand the benefits of using the clinics and health institutions. They're not aware. There needs to be information campaigns, and there needs to be vouchers to sort of motivate them, give them incentives to use these facilities. But the qualitative work gave out a very different explanation as to why tribal women are not using clinics. And that was the fact that they're not being treated with dignity in these institutions. The healthcare providers were looking down on them and perhaps making fun of their cultural practices or making fun of the way they looked or they dressed or they talked. And instead of taking advantage of these health institutions, tribal women were taking the chance. They were making a rational choice of staying home, giving birth at home, and risking their own lives and the lives of their children. So this just shows that underlying the proximate reasons for poor outcomes can be very complex reasons which are not immediately visible and not always measurable using quantitative outcomes and the surveys, the attitude or other types of surveys that I mentioned throughout this talk. So I just want to conclude and make sure that we have enough time for questions and answers. So what is the big lesson from this? Before measuring social inclusion and exclusion, we need to ask the right question. We need to think about what social inclusion and exclusion means in a specific context. We need to think about the identity groups that are being excluded. We need to think about the different areas from which these people are excluded, say market, services, and spaces, and think about the channels of exclusion. And once we do this, and the Inclusion Matters report actually gives a very good starting point in terms of thinking about issues of inclusion and exclusion. Once we've identified these factors in a specific context, there are actually a wealth of available data sources we can use to map and to go deeper and explore issues of inclusion and exclusion. But once we measured, we need to make sure that we go beyond symptoms and ask why. So we need to remember that measures are just symptoms or flags about inclusion and exclusion issues, but we need to understand the processes that lead to these symptoms and manifestations. And for that, mixed methods, like I mentioned earlier, could be very useful. And finally, the real test of social inclusion is not about just measuring these issues. That's just the starting point. The real test is to ask why these outcomes obtained for certain groups and to focus on the drivers and the processes of inclusion and exclusion. So I will just stop there and we will proceed with some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amjad, for this very interesting presentation. And I know everyone has many questions, but first let's move to a polling exercise. You will see on your screen 3 questions, and please select one answer that you think that you like the most, and then Amjad will address your answers. So the first question is, which of the following is a good measure of social inclusion at the country level? A, per capita income. B, poverty headcount. C, income inequality. D, none of the above. So please vote now. Okay, thank you so much, Amjad.
All right. So again, the question was, which of the following is a good measure of social inclusion at the country level? And this is a bit of a trick question. I need to be honest with the audience. So all of the options that you have are focusing on economic measures of well-being, whether it's in the form of income, whether it's in the form of income being below a threshold point, or whether income being drastically skewed in some direction. And 68% of you are actually saying that income inequality is a good measure of social inclusion at the country level. And this is very interesting. I mean, I would agree with the audience that compared to per capita income and poverty, income inequality is probably closer to the idea of social inclusion and exclusion. But at the end of the day, income inequality is also about just income. And we mentioned that inclusion and exclusion does not have to be about material issues, economic issues. It is possible for someone to be on the higher points of income inequality and have access to a lot of economic resources, but excluded on the basis of some other identity, whether it's their gender, whether it's their ethnicity, whether it's their disability status, or any number of other identities you can think of. But it's very interesting that people focused on income inequality more than others.
So thank you for voting, and now we are moving to question number 2. And it is, which one of the following is easier to measure? Inclusion or exclusion in markets, services, or spaces? So A is markets, B services, C spaces. Okay, we can start voting now.
All right, very, very interesting finding. 70% of our participants believe that it's easier to measure inclusion and exclusion in services. And you know, this could be biased by the fact that I gave some examples from services, whether it was access to electricity and access to education. And it's generally true that measuring inclusion and exclusion in markets and services is relatively easier, because these are concepts that are pretty much well defined. We know what the labor market is, And we have plenty of data measuring access to labor markets or land markets or other types of financial markets and things, other things that one can think of. Similarly, for services, we have a good idea about what these things are, and usually services are provided by, say, a government or another service provider, which can build in indicators to sort of have some idea about who is accessing, who is making good use of the services. So I agree, it's relatively easier to measure services, inclusion, exclusion in services. Whereas spaces that's a more vague concept, right? Spaces can be about political spaces, it can be about cultural spaces, or it can be literally spaces, like regional segregation could be an issue. And based on the data sources that are available to resources, it's not always easy to measure spaces. But I must add that there are well-devised measures of dignity, voice, power, empowerment. So it is possible to measure inclusion and exclusion in all three of these areas. But I agree that spaces can be a little bit more difficult.
Okay, thank you so much. And now the final question. Do you agree that social inclusion or exclusion is more important to measure in developing countries? A, agree, B, disagree. It's a very interesting question. So let's see what our participants think.
Perfect. So 73% of our participants, approximately, disagree with this statement that social inclusion or exclusion is more important to measure in developing countries. And I agree with you 100%. Social inclusion is not about developed or less developed countries. In fact, it's one of the areas where this division between developing countries and developed countries is becoming more and more blurry, because excluded groups exist in every country. Exclusion does not need to be about poverty or inequality or material forms of deprivation. It exists in the United States. It exists in Europe. So you can think of racial segregation in the United States as an extreme form of social exclusion. You can think about the exclusion of the Roma in Europe, or the exclusion of people who are unemployed, and migrants or people who belong to a particular religion, both in developed countries and developing countries, especially migrants, can be excluded everywhere. So it's very nice to see that our participants agree with us that exclusion does not have to be about less developed countries.
Great, great. Thank you so much. And now let's move to questions. I know we have about, I think, 10, 15 minutes for questions. So let's start with a question we have from participants. I see a question from Diana Hinova. She's asking, Amjad, could you speak to whether there has been any research on social exclusion being a direct policy or a policy outcome that governments consciously ignore, and best strategies to counteract in that situation without creating a conflict?
Right. That's a very good question. But before I give an answer, I mean, I will give a teaser of an answer, but I just want to remind everyone that our next series, next webinar in the series is going to focus on policy and what can programs do, or what the policies and programs not do so well in social inclusion and exclusion. So I don't want to preempt that discussion by giving a full answer. But it is possible sometimes the policies and programs that development practitioners or governments advocate for unintentionally leave out certain groups. So that could be an issue of not identifying the groups that are excluded properly in the beginning. So that could be the result of failure at the diagnosis stage. And that could be sort of result of unanticipated impacts that a policy or program might have over time, which creates new forms of inclusion or exclusion of different groups. So it is definitely possible, and we have plenty of examples in the last two chapters of our book. But like I said, I do not want to preempt the next webinar, which will focus specifically on these types of questions. So I would encourage you to tune in on our next seminar as well.
Okay, well, actually, I want to take advantage. We had some questions sent earlier, so I wanted to ask you questions sent by Carmen Monico. How do you account for the multiple social, economic, cultural, political, including legal differences existing across countries?
Right. So that's a very good question, and it really speaks to the idea of context specificity, how social inclusion is specific to time, place, and identities. So you're right, there are differences across countries in terms of who is excluded, what they're excluded from, the historical events and sort of relationships, power relationships that precede the outcome, the exclusionary outcome that we see. And there's no easy answer to this question. From a measurement point of view, though, sometimes we need to be careful about making comparisons across countries, because what can count as a social exclusion issue in one context might not be so in another context. And even the questions that I mentioned, like from the attitude surveys, the perception surveys, we need to exercise caution in how we interpret those questions, because those questions may have been interpreted in different ways by people who participated in these surveys, who were asked these questions. So we should always start from the point of context specificity, try to conceptualize what social inclusion might mean in our own context. And whenever we're making cross-country comparisons, we need to exercise caution. But like I mentioned, there are a wealth of different data sources where you can look at similar outcomes across countries, but we need to be careful about what we compare.
Well, let's move to another question from Felipe Francisco de Souza. Can land markets reduce land inequality in developing countries? And how to measure properly land inequality according to your experience?
Right. So it's a very, very good question. And the same question can be asked about a number of different sectors. One can ask the same about measuring labor market inequalities, and there are lots of studies that do that, both in sociology, economics, and a lot of development organizations have actually adopted these indicators. When it comes to land, again, like any sector, there are indicators, whether it's in terms of measuring who has access to land, who has access to land titles. There are lots of gender-based differences across the world, not just in developing countries, but in developed countries as well. So projects and programs that target land titling or other land issues usually incorporate indices or some sort of measure that captures how land is distributed, both across different identity groups, and also in terms of even within households between men and women. So there are lots of indicators available. I cannot remember a specific land project that I can I can reference here, but I know that these indicators are being collected as part of land distribution and titling and all sorts of other land interventions.
Okay. So now let's move to another question from, we have a question from Jose Cuesta. He says, my impression is that surveys that capture perceptions, attitudes, preferences, etc. do not capture outcomes or processes, while those capturing objective indicators do not capture attitudes. Can we do more and better in surveys that combine both outcomes and attitudes?
That's a very good comment and very good question. Right. So surveys household surveys, censuses, and all sorts of objective, the so-called objective indicators that we collect do not do very well in terms of capturing views and opinions. And then we have very good surveys focusing on perceptions, attitudes, and preferences. They don't capture outcomes. But there are ways of so right now there are different sources for each of these two types of data. We can complement them, right? I mean, going forward, we can come up with surveys that measure outcomes at the same time as measuring attitudes and perceptions, and complement them within the same research design. Of course, that would be ideal. And even complementing that kind of a survey with whether it's focus group discussions, whether it's individual interviews, observational studies, some qualitative or historical component. Of course, that would be the ideal research design. But what usually happens is, because of resource constraints and in terms of expertise, mixed methods and interdisciplinary research is still considered a niche area where not a lot of people focus on. So given this level of specialization, usually economists and people who come from quantitative background focus on measuring these so-called objective indicators, and others tend to focus a bit more on attitudes and perceptions. But this just underlines the importance of mixed methods going forward, how we need people and institutions to complement each type of data and perhaps gather this information within a compatible research design. And there's a big research on this area. It's called Q-squared research. It originally originates from poverty research, Q-squared, combining qualitative and quantitative in poverty analysis. And that area has been growing, and even the World Bank has done some work on this with the Moving Out of Poverty study, combining qualitative and quantitative surveys within the same design.
Okay, great. Let us, do we have, I think we have time for about maybe one more question. So there is a question from Masedi Kadimilwe Chukuduku. And he's asking, what would you say about geographical locations in relation to exclusion and inclusion?
Right, that's a very good question, because location is very closely linked with the outcome disparities that we observe, and that's sometimes because of the rural-urban division. Sometimes that's because of economics of agglomeration. Development happens in one region and another region is left behind. But sometimes location is actually a proxy for something else. So some ethnic groups or ethnic minorities or religious minorities might be living in a certain region, and because of historical circumstances and lack of power and influence over policies, maybe those regions are not able to lobby for greater investments. So usually we see that location and region overlaps with outcome gaps, whether it's in terms of poverty, inequality, access to services, access to institutions and accountability and voice, political participation. We see very close relationship between the two. So when we do empirical analysis, this gives us a little bit of a wiggle room in terms of, when we don't have, let's say for political reasons in a country, there's no information on ethnic groups. There's no information on religious groups that would allow us to sort of measure gaps across different identity groups. Sometimes location can be a very good proxy for measuring gaps across identity groups, even though it's not necessarily an identity group in of itself. So it's a very good. Depending on the context, we need to be careful what location is a proxy for, though. Depending on the context, it can be a very good proxy for identifying excluded groups.
Okay, thank you so much. And I see so many more very interesting questions, and I know you would like to answer them all, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So I do want to remind everyone that this presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be posted within 24 hours on the E-Institute website. So please go back, and we will also send it to you by email to all the participants. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your participation. There's obviously interest in this topic, and our next webinar will take this topic one step further. We'll talk about policies and programs and how to design socially inclusive interventions. In the meantime, follow MJET on Twitter at MJETTAS. And we usually post information about social inclusion on Twitter with hashtag #InclusionMatters. Thank you so much for participating, and see you next time.
Thank you.